Okay, today we're going to be talking about, ions. Okay, we're going to discuss what an ion is, how an ion is formed, what types of ions exist, and how one ion is different from another ion. There's two different types of ions, and we'll discuss that as well. Okay, let me just get a pen going, get my pen color out, and use blue today. Okay. All right. Just before we begin, though, we want to do a quick review of atomic structure. Okay. The part meaning the parts of the atom. You have to remember, we discussed the other day, this is our general structure of an atom. This happens to be a lithium atom, and how do I know? Well, I see the key for protons is red. I count 1, 2, 3 protons. I look on my periodic table for the atomic number. Remember, the number of protons is equal to the atomic number of an element. So the proton number has 3 protons. Atomic number 3, I look on the periodic table, it is lithium. Right? Then you have the neutrons, which are also in the nucleus. So you have the positive protons, the no-charge neutrons, and then negatively charged electrons. Okay. And remember, the overall charge of an atom, as it appears in the periodic table, is neutral, meaning there are equal number of protons and equal number of electrons in the atom in that particular state. So if you look here and you add up the protons, which each have a positive charge, you have 1, 2, 3 protons, so you have 3 positive charges, okay? And you have 1, 2, 3 electrons, which is 3 negative charges. If you add the positive charges and the negative charges, you'll find that there is a net overall charge of 0. So there's no charge in this particular atom. Okay, so just to recap, electrically balanced atoms have equal numbers of protons and electrons. Okay. Ions are formed when atoms gain or lose an electron. All right, if you notice this atom up top here, it has 2 shells present because there are 3 electrons. You have the K shell, which can hold 2 electrons in it, and the L shell, which can hold up to 8 electrons in it. This particular atom only has 1 electron. All right, other atoms may have 7 electrons in their outer shell and 1 space to fill, because the L shell can hold up to 8 electrons. The K shell can hold 2 electrons. Now, the overall activity of an atom is to try and fill its outer shells. So some atoms give away electrons to fill their outer shell. Like, for instance, this lithium atom, if it gives away this 1 electron, it technically has a full outer shell, which would be the K shell, because it no longer has any electrons in its L shell. Other atoms, such as fluorine, okay, a fluorine atom has 9 protons, okay, it has 9 protons and 9 electrons surrounding it. Okay, it actually has 10 neutrons. It says 9 protons, 10 neutrons, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 electrons. So this is a fluorine atom that's neutral. It has 9 protons, 9 electrons. Now, fluorine would happily take this electron from lithium, which would make it more negative. So you would end up with 10 electrons, 9 protons, and an unbalanced electrical charge. So a fluorine atom would end up with a -1 electrical charge. And by losing this electron, okay, this lithium atom has 3 protons, okay, and 2 electrons, which gives it an overall net charge of +1. So you end up with opposite charges. Okay, and we'll discuss how they relate to each other in a second. So back to the atom. The outermost shell of an atom is called the valence shell or valence electron, or valence orbital. Okay, in that shell you have electrons. The electrons in the valence shell are called valence electrons. So if anybody ever asks you how many valence electrons does a lithium atom have, well, you look to the outermost shell and you count the number of electrons there. So in this one, you'd have 1. In a neutral atom of fluorine, you would have 9 valence electrons. 7 valence electrons. So you'd have 7 electrons in the outermost shell. 9 overall, So an ion is an atom that has an electrical charge. It's either a positive charge or a negative charge. So when an ion gains electrons, it ends up becoming a negative ion. If it loses electrons, it becomes a positive ion. Okay, so just to recap what they just said there. How does a neutral atom end up with a charge? Well, it either loses or gains electrons. Once again, atoms that gain electrons become more negative or negative ions. Atoms that lose electrons become more positive, or what we call positive ions. Another name for a positive ion is called a cation. Another name for a negative ion is called an anion. Okay, one of the ways I remember that is the T in cation looks like a positive sign. Okay. So just to recap, an ion is formed when an atom has an unequal number of protons and electrons. Okay? And that occurs because atoms are constantly trying to fill their valence shell with a full set of electrons. And just the K shell, which is the innermost shell closest to the nucleus. So we have the nucleus. Okay, then we have the K shell, which can hold 2 electrons. Okay, the L shell, which can hold 8 electrons. The M shell, which can hold 8 electrons as well. And there's a couple more shells. All right, there's actually 7 total orbitals, but we're only going to get into the first 3 for the time being. Okay. So atoms that gain electrons become negative ions. Atoms that lose electrons become positive ions. Atoms with opposite ionic charges form ionic compounds, and we're going to see that right here. Okay? We're going to see how an ionic compound is formed by atoms trading or gaining or losing electrons and ending up with electrical charges that are opposite, which cause them to be attracted to one another. Okay? So you'll see sodium, what you see here is the formation of sodium chloride from a sodium atom and a chlorine atom. So you have neutral sodium atom here. Okay, you have the neutral sodium atom here and the neutral chlorine atom here. All right. When they trade, or when the chlorine gains the electron from the sodium and the sodium loses the electron to the chlorine, you form a compound called sodium chloride. Some of you may have heard of that before because it's actually the chemical name for salt. Okay? So sodium chloride is actually an ionic compound. It is formed when the neutral sodium atom loses its valence electron to the neutral chlorine atom so that the neutral chlorine atom can fill its valence shell with 8 electrons. Remember, we said the K shell can hold 2 electrons. The L shell holds 8 and it's happy and totally full. And the M shell wants to fill 8. So it's much easier. There's much less electrical attraction between the electrons and the sodium atom and the chlorine atom. So it pulls it away, it rips it away there, and it steals it or takes it from the sodium atom. So what you end up with is a sodium ion, which has a +1 net charge, and a chlorine ion, which has a -1 charge, and those opposite charges cause these two atoms to be attracted to one another, and so they hang out and form a compound called sodium chloride. So if you look at this and you counted up the protons, because the protons and neutrons never change, the nucleus doesn't change in the formation of an ion. Okay, so you still have 11 protons, which makes this sodium. But if you look and you count up the electrons now, you only have 10 electrons. So 11 positive protons compared to 10 negative electrons gives you an overall +1 charge, which they call a cation. And what happens here with the chlorine atom, you have 17 protons. The electron is taken from the sodium. It gives you 8 electrons in the outermost shell, so the shell is full, and a total of 18 negative electrons and 17 positive protons, which is an electrical imbalance of -1. So the oppositely charged ions is what what forms that compound. All right, it's the imbalance of protons and electrons is what actually gives each atom its charge. Okay, so the sodium ion becomes positive because it lost an electron. The chlorine ion becomes negative because it gained an electron. You see this negative charge here. Okay, you have a positive. You now have a positive charge with the sodium atom and a negative charge with the chlorine atom. Okay. So if you count up the protons, will always stay the same. So chlorine's always going to have 17 protons. Okay, you notice that here. And sodium is always going to have 11 protons. What will change, though, in the formation of an ion is the number of electrons. Okay. You should also notice that the valence shells are full right now due to the transfer of electrons from the sodium atom, or electron from the sodium atom to the chlorine atom. Okay? So let's recap. Okay? Valence electrons. All right? The transfer of valence electrons is essential in the formation of an ion. If an atom gains, if you gain valence electrons, you become more negative. You become a negative ion. If you lose valence electrons, you become a positive ion. So an ion is an atom that has a charge because it has either gained or lost valence electrons. This is how this is type of ionic bonds. These are how ionic compounds are formed. When one atom loses an electron to another atom, it ends up with a charge, an opposite charge of the atom it's losing it to, and they end up forming a compound with one another. All right, you have positive and negative ions that exist. A positive ion, like we said, is something that loses an electron, and it's called a cation. And a negative ion is an atom that gains an electron. Protons and neutrons in an ion do not change. Okay? So, with that said, and even though an ion may be formed, the atomic number remains the same. And so does the atomic mass. Okay? Okay, remember the atomic number is the number of protons. Okay? And the atomic mass is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons in an ion. Okay? And that's going to be it for today. All right? Have a good day.